Good evening, everybody. Welcome. We are thrilled to have you here for this panel discussion on how Ireland created and why they open sourced COVID Green. My name is Jenny Wanger, and I'm on the leadership team at the Linux Foundation Public Health. We are one of the Linux Foundation's newest umbrella organizations dedicated to figuring out different ways in which open source technology can help advance public health initiatives and ultimately, at the moment, help us all get through this pandemic together and get out of our homes more quickly and safely as fast as we can. At the moment, we're focused on exposure notification, and over time, we plan to expand that out into other public health applications. I am here with two members of NearForm and Gar from the Health Services. Gar, I'm going to let you introduce yourself since I'm already, I'm off to a great start.
Sure.
This is going to be a really natural and casual conversation. So Gar, why don't you start by introducing yourself, and then Cian and Denise, would you also do the same?
Sure. And I don't blame you. Most people struggle with my surname. You get as far as Gar and then the next bit. So it's Gar Mac Criosta. And it's the accent on the I that kills everybody. And I work for the Health Service Executive, and I'm the lead for the COVID Tracker app, which was the Irish-based contact tracing app.
So my name is Cian O'Madine. I'm the CEO at NearForm, and myself and Gar have been having many weekend and evening calls for quite a while, working together on the COVID Tracker app.
And I'm Denise Cooper. I also work for NearForm, and I've also spent a fair amount of time talking to both of these gentlemen about this app. So,
absolutely. So maybe to start, Denise, could you help orient everybody? What is exposure notification? Is it different from contact tracing?
Sure. So contact tracing is well understood. It is the technology that knocked down SARS-1. It's something that epidemiologists have developed, and it is the practice of figuring out who is making who else sick. So you're tracing back to patient zero, and that used to be done manually. That's how they got through eradicating smallpox in India, one village at a time. It's a very time-consuming process. Contact tracing using a little surveillance device that we all carry at all times, like a phone, is a new idea because the phone ubiquity has only been with us for a little while. It wasn't practical even 10 years ago when SARS-1 happened. So it is a way to do some of the same things. However, it has some inherent differences as well. It's more automatic, which is nice, and it goes faster. We can find people faster, but because of privacy concerns and the power of those little devices to really create problems, we've had to design very carefully around the need to get contact tracing to work while still respecting privacy.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, privacy and security have been really major concerns in the development of these apps. And these apps, many of them started with open source, right? If you look back at the protocols prior to Apple and Google, if you TCN Coalition, DP3T, many of the early initiatives were open source. Google and Apple then took that technology, built it into the operating systems, and then created a way for a lot of people to easily build apps on top of that. We're now seeing a lot of those apps open source. On that topic of privacy and security, and this could be for anyone, how has that whole open source process made it different from some other projects you maybe have worked on?
Gar, I think this one's yours.
Yeah, I mean, like it's open sourcing things within so I've done a lot of work in the public service across a range of different agencies and departments, and open sourcing is it's common in some places, but it's not institutionalized. So it's not part of the way people think about things. So in this case, I think just given the nature of it and given the needs and drivers towards transparency, that was kind of the key piece in the first place in order to try and get people comfortable with the idea of what this does. And it's not that, so, and it's quite, as total aside, one of the first things, so open source, I'll explain how misunderstood this was, in that somebody asked me for, can you send me the source? And we're expecting a Word document with the source code, right? So that's where we're starting from. And I think that, so there's kind of a piece here at the very beginning in terms of explaining what it is, but equally open sourcing it, the vast majority of people looking at the code base wouldn't make head or tail of it. They couldn't understand it. But what it did allow was experts in their field who were interested in security or in privacy or in other aspects of the design of the app, it could be accessibility or user experience, to explore the app, to dive into it, to dig deep into it, and to figure out and to give us feedback on that. And that was part of the, I guess, the beauty of something like this. And I think it sets the stage for where open source can play a larger part across government, certainly in Ireland anyway. And I think that conversation has started, and that conversation will evolve.
And maybe we are getting a little bit ahead of ourselves in some ways, right, Gar?
Sure.
Could you tell me a little bit about when did Ireland decide to get involved in exposure notification, and how did they make the decision? How did the decision to open source that code base happen?
So I guess the start of this journey began, it was actually St. Patrick's Day. So back in, just shortly before that, actually, where, of course it was, yeah. So national holiday, what else have you got to be doing? Let's wonder about what can we do? And but it was a general problem of how do we use technology to support contact tracing? Because contact tracing was going to be an issue for us. So how do we do that? And this was a cross-government collaboration to try and understand what that was. And that boils down to, how do you find people who are too close for too long? Right. So that's where the journey started. And the open source piece didn't come for a while, but the beginning of the process was an exploration of how do we solve for that particular problem. And I think that's where you start this. It began, and once Trace Together was released in Singapore, it became clear that, and the NHS, PEPPT, DP3T, and others. So there were kind of teams globally who were kind of coalescing on one way of doing this is with Bluetooth and proximity detection. So it began to go down that road. The overarching thing in the background was that if you look at some of the problems that we would face with rolling this out and getting mass adoption, it was one of the foremost ones is trust. So, and how do you build trust? Trust is with transparency. So then the question was open sourcing. And PEPPT, DP3T, TCN, others had, the guys in MIT as well, had all open source code bases at that point. So from a transparency perspective, it was driven from that. So it wasn't a big decision. So it wasn't a decision that would be, it wasn't seen as this massive decision to open source it, right? It was more or less a matter of course that we should do this because it's part of it. So it wasn't framed as kind of it's a big thing and it's going to define us. It was something that we decided, and then how we were going to open source it, under what license, where we were going to put it, what we were going to do with it, but also building an understanding of what open sourcing it meant. So that kind of, but it pretty much all took place before the end of March. Like all of those decisions had been made, and we had really kind of crystallized on something, but it was very much a journey of exploration at the very start of it.
And can I say something? Two things. One is, because those predecessors had open sourced their code, we were already standing on the shoulders of giants because we could see what they had done, and it helped us pivot through the morass of choices to get the outcome we were looking for. So that was really important. So we wanted to continue that conversation. But also, there's open source and there's open source. Initially, this code was only published, as in it was visible, but there was no attempt to build a community behind it. There was no attempt to make it usable by other people, other than as an exemplar in the same way that the previous ones had been exemplars for us. And then the third piece, which Cian's going to want to talk about more, is how a familiarity with open source made it possible for NearForm to put this together so quickly. Right?
Yeah, yeah. I think going back to the point there, just about it's almost like there was this like rapidly emerging best practice for response to the pandemic from the very get-go. Where again, like it was to start with, it was code sharing, publishing of code, but not open source, which is a different thing. Yeah, it was kind of, it just was signposted, I suppose, from the very beginning. It was like, this absolutely should be open sourced. This is the way to do it. for all the reasons, transparency being a huge one. And yeah, I think
I actually think you were super courageous, Cian, in the real open sourcing to Linux Public Health, Linux Foundation Public Health, because you were giving up business opportunity and doing it. And that calculus of why, how that works, how you make that choice, especially for an SME like yourself, is really interesting, I think.
Yeah, but I mean, it just goes back to the philosophy of open source. I mean, you have the kind of old school mentality, which is, why would you open source this thing? You can charge the same amount to the next government or whatever, or keep it proprietary and all that kind of stuff. And but then going back to the philosophy of open source, it's like, well, let's make this as successful as we possibly can. Let's share it with as many people as we possibly can. And you take a company like NearForm, like we're 150 odd people. Like we're never going to even be able to do close to all of the work that needs to be done. So let's try and enable other people to pick the thing up and use it. Hence the naming for the project, is COVID green. Like it was green for Ireland, but also green for turning the map back green again. It's a beautiful thing to think that the work that went on in Ireland in March, April of this year, and all the thought that went into the level of utility that was put into the app, and all the various things that went on, that you can transpose that into other societies and different parts of the world, and other people. You can solve other people's problems, and that's a lovely thing to be involved in. So yeah.
I always remember that first conversation we had internally. So from a timing perspective, what happened was Gar and I had a conversation to suss out whether NearForm would be the right company to take the thing to. And then we had a conversation, Cian and I and his management team had a conversation. And in that conversation, I remember it was the beginning of the lockdown. Everybody was feeling pretty powerless. And I remember Helene saying, God, wouldn't it be lovely to be able to do something? Right? And at that moment, it was pretty clear to me there was a possibility that it would be bigger than just Ireland. But the Linux Foundation afforded us the opportunity to make that real. So we're starting to see feature donations to the Linux Foundation COVID Green app code base from other countries that have picked up the code base and made use of it. And one of the interesting things that's happening is some countries that already have solved the problem once, as in they've already rolled out an app, are looking again and seeing the success of this particular app and saying, wow, maybe we should do this again using this code base and this approach. So we found the right approach. I think it took every single person working on the project to help guide it in the direction of the right approach. Gar was super courageous, explaining to the ministers that he works for why we weren't ready to release it yet. We were trying again. We actually wrote it 3 full times before we were able to release it. And that had to do with, Gar will say more about this, but that had to do with architecture and a bunch of other choices. You want to do a version of that?
Yeah, I mean, like if you look at where we started, so when we started, there was no Google Apple exposure notification. That didn't exist. And exposure notification wasn't even in our language, right? So we weren't even using that language at that point in time. So that came along in April, at some point in April, but up until that point, so we started off as it was like a big data geo play where we were tracking people on location and geo time boxes and trying to fit people into that. And it didn't work. Right, for a variety of reasons, but just the lack of precision with GPS being one. The second one was the centralized architecture that was modeling itself on Singapore and the Trace Together app, which was basically from a teardown of that and then being informed by what the guys in the NHS were doing, what the guys in PEP-PT and DP3T were doing. It was informed by that and trying to figure it out. And this was, it's interesting as well because you're seeing all of these things building in parallel. So all of these teams trying to solve for the same problem and then beginning to share. And not being told to share and not agreeing that they must, and not country to country. It was just sharing, just people calling other people and saying, hey, I
Yeah.
found something, here it is, or hey.
No license for this information.
Yeah, and so that very much set the tone for it. And then Apple and Google came along, which is the third iteration of this, trying to figure out what it was. How do we use this embryonic API that still wasn't there? I think like when we started on this, there was 3 methods implemented on the API: start, stop, and pause. That was it, right? And pause disappeared. So we were up and running very quickly with something that that was still moving. It was quite literally the plane was in the air as we were trying to figure out what it was. Well, certainly it was on the runway. We wanted to make sure that by the time it started to lift off, that it was okay. So I think there's challenges around just how you think about some of that and the timing around it. And actually at the time, I was talking to one of the guys in the Department of Health recently, and we actually thought we had missed it. If we didn't get this app out by May, COVID would be over, right? That's a wonderful thought, but a wonderful dream, how romantic and kind of naive we were at the time. But as we were looking at it, there was an awful lot of time pressure. And if you look at it through the lens of the growing caseload and the global impact of COVID and the impact on society and just how people were feeling, that was kind of, it nearly got embodied in the project in what we were doing, because we were feeling that, and we were feeling that we were kind of battling against it, to what both Denise and Cian were saying. There was no sense that you had to drag people in to work on this. Like, people were willingly sacrificing weekends, evenings, whatever needed to be done. And this is across all of the groups. So like NearForm, the other partners who were on the test side of it, on the security and data protection side, it was everybody just got involved, and across all the agencies and departments.
Yeah, I think it's really, if you look at the history of exposure notification, it is amazing to think through the degree of collaboration that started, the way in which we were all talking around the world. I had calls with Stanford and with Singapore and, all sorts of people across Europe and the US and South America. It was really a global community coming together with just it. And I think because a couple of those key projects at the beginning started open source, it became the default. And that collaboration, that participation from everybody, the banding together, I think was really, it helped, to me, it helped accelerate the entire process quite a bit, right? If you look at normal timelines for producing government technology and, or public health technology in general, we started this whole thing in March. We had the first apps out, we really started to see momentum around them in June. We now are here in October, and we've seen, how many different countries and states at this point have a COVID green app launched? I think it's, one of you will know the number better than me.
I think we're into double figures now. I'm pretty sure we
Yeah.
are.
Now the work is unreal expectations about what the app is supposed to do, which is a different battle, right?
So can I just ground what Jen? So I worked on something back in the mid 2000s, way back, and it was a European integration project. It was running for 4 years before I started, and it didn't go live for another 3 years. So 7 years from start to finish. This is something that was up and running in 100 days from start to finish. And we had interoperability stood up, which was another chunk on top of that. Within probably, I think it was another 6 weeks after we went live, interoperability, and then EU interoperability stood up last week. So like the speed at which this is done, and this is agreeing on standards across European countries to agree how we're going to do it, how we're going to secure it, how it's going to work, the data protection implications. And it's a great demonstration of how this can work and how the pace can be brought. Nobody wants to work at this insane speed, not forever, but
Cian does.
Cian does. It's a demonstration of how we can work at this speed, and there's the assumption that we have to go slow to be safe. It's just like it's a fallacy.
Yeah, I have to plug NearForm for a second, because the first working prototype that we produced, remember he said we started on St. Patrick's Day, the first working prototype was done 5 days later, like that fast. And the reason we were able to do that is that NearForm was already using a number of accelerators that are open source now that we use to be able to deploy quickly, because we have the characteristics and because we know a lot about the tools that are being used. And that came because of Cian's interest in open source. So
yeah, God bless open source. Love
open source is art, right?
Open source is art. Yeah. I think as well, probably one of the points to make, which is, you know, worth making as well. I can remember talking to, I can't remember who it was, but kind of mid-May, somebody on the stateside said to me, "Oh, you need to put it into an open source project." And at the time, I was like, "No, we don't. We need to actually get it done first. We need the thing has to actually get to the point where it's got utility and it's somewhat proven. And once it gets to that point, then we create, you know, we share something that that others can use." So it wasn't the primary thing that led the project. It was one of the things we knew we had to do, but it was doing it at a point in time when it was the right time. And you know, for us, Gar, I suppose it was what, about the thing launched in July the 7th.
July 7th.
It was my birthday. Yay. But I think the code was put up probably mid-June. It's probably about 3 weeks or thereabouts.
For the privacy experts to look at it.
Yeah.
And why was it so important to have that timing between like how finished the code was?
So can I have a crack at that one? Because I think that there is a piece here where there was a demand for transparency. And if you look at that demand for transparency, if we made the stuff at the start transparent, I mean, we had enough to deal with in the media just dealing with what we were dealing with at that time. If we said we're building a big data geo-based thing, right, that would blow up straight away, right? We got dinged on the centralized architecture, right? So we had to fight that off. And then the Google Apple thing came. So what were we going to be transparent about? Like, we could be transparent about what problem we were trying to solve, but not how we were going to solve it. And that notion of trying to do that, I think that's one of the things in this, is that there is a tension between transparency and innovation, right? There's this natural tension between the two. And when you don't know what you're trying to do, you kind of need to just look after your own business and figure it out. And then you can tell people what you're doing. So when we were ready to go, we did. But up until that point, we couldn't, because literally we're like when we open sourced that code base, it was on its third iteration. I think we were only like 4 or 5 weeks into the build of that iteration of the app. So it was one of those things that there's a right time. And I think that's one of the challenges for anybody going into this and anybody going down this path. They're like, some of that, like DP3T and PEPT were born out of academic research. So they were kind of born in that area. They could comfortably go out and open source from the very beginning. It's a very different situation to put a public body or a bunch of public bodies into the middle of this and say, here's what we're doing, right? Because immediately it becomes a polarizing thing.
We lost Jenny for a second. She'll be back.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you're saying, Gar. I think that there is a right time. And I remember having that conversation with you about where that right time lands. I mean, for us working in NearForm, because we're working at, you know, the fastest pace we can probably, hi Jenny, the fastest pace we can probably possibly do, we had concerns that we needed to tidy the code a little bit before it got open sourced. And, you know, to the people that aren't in this panel that really could be or should be, the primary team that worked on the Irish version of this app, they were putting in so many hours, you know, basically we worked 7 days a week, you know, flat out until we delivered the app. And then there were several weeks of Ireland testing it, making sure, and then Gar and people that Gar works with selling the idea up through the ministries, because there had been a lot of unfortunate media coverage about how COVID tracing apps worked that were working against us. So for a while there, the Oxford report was misquoted in the media saying that you had to have 60% adoption in order to even bother. Why would you even bother if you couldn't get that much? And that 60% is a big ask. And we have the best adoption of any app in any country in Ireland, but we're not at 60% even now. And so one of the things that had to happen was that misfact had to be fixed in the minds of the ministers. And that work was all done by Gar, right? And his colleagues.
Not just by me. There was a bunch of us involved in that one. So yeah, there was a lot of people working hard to make sure that the message got across clearly in Department of Health and deeper in Garda, Defence Forces and others. So yeah, I can't take full credit for that, much as I would love to.
No, but I think what we're
Big fan
telling
of
you
a
is
lot of
that
it
it was
though,
a, yeah, I think what we're telling you is it was a really fortunate confluence of where we were in the order of people trying to do this and what our characteristics were. So for instance, a lot of the other pieces of the puzzle already existed in Ireland. Like there was already a phone bank that could be trained to do the phone part of contact tracing. There was already adequate testing capabilities. There was already the fact that we don't have enough beds for a full out unchecked growth. So we had to shut down aggressively, and Ireland's doing that again right now for the same reasons. You know, we have to keep it managed. So we had more discipline than a lot of countries have exhibited. But mostly also we happen to have indigenous you know, help in the form of NearForm. That's a very unusual company. It's sitting in a town that's only 11,000 people in this beautiful resort town that Cian doesn't want to leave. So it's an example for Ireland of how tech could be, you know, in the future of Ireland. And they're all looking at all of these pieces because of the success of this thing. So it's been a real springboard, I think, or hopefully will be for all of that.
And as COVID Green has been adopted in different places, right? And as you've helped with the rollout of that, how has it changed from one country to the next? Have there been differences?
Well, yeah, so different localization requirements in big cities like New York City means that we have better support for languages other than English and Irish now, right?
Yeah, I think I make the point that it's actually a real case study for open source in general, like a project like this. So you know, we're at whatever 10, probably 10 or more public health authorities now have adopted the technology, but actually each one brings its own set of requirements. There's an awful lot of commonality. I mean, if you look at the UI, I think for the most part the UI has stayed pretty much the same as the one that we built in Ireland. But then from a language perspective, I think there's 9 languages now out of the box.
Some of them right to left, right?
And then also, I mean, even like with the COVID task force in the US, like we had some really distinguished engineers from some of the big tech companies got involved in the project, and they built a huge amount of resilience and all that stuff into the both like the testing side of things and also on the back end side of things. And so, you know, project on project, actually the incremental investment in the technology has been really interesting, you know. So and it's a real case study, I suppose, for open source in general, that like the number 11 or 12, whatever number we're at now, who want to pick this thing up, they're getting the benefit of all the previous experiences and all the resilience and all the previous work that's been done, and that just makes it a lot easier for them to, with confidence, be able to stand this thing up and deploy it, and to know that you know it's ready for prime time, you know.
Yeah, and have you also been able to pull those changes back into the apps that have already launched? How has that worked?
So we had a release yesterday, whatever day. I can't remember when we pushed it in. And that included features that we had discussed that were, one of them had been implemented in Scotland that we pulled it back in, which is the ability to pause. There was another one, which is a language switcher, which either came from Pennsylvania or New Jersey. I'm not really sure which, but it was one of the states in the US. So we were getting bits like this. And as we see, as we look at the roadmap for this, we're also touching base with other teams around to say, what are you thinking about? What are you looking at? Where is this going? And there are definitely core bits where we can feed in together. So the core kind of ENS wrapper, what it does, how that works. Also from like on the metric side of it, like how we're measuring this, things that we're doing. So it's not that, not necessarily all of it is kind of the UX end of it in terms of features for the app. Some of it is actually the thinking around, how would I monitor and know this is working? How do I show efficacy? How do I do those things? So as other people have those ideas, it gets wrapped back in and we benefit from all of that. Plus anything that pops up where, say, external security reviews, anything like that that pops up and that surfaces something that we should look at, that's all getting rolled back in. And we're downstream from that, so we benefit straight away. And we can pick and choose the bits that fit. And I think in terms of the differences, so like, I mean, Northern Ireland was the first other health authority who picked it up, and our apps couldn't be further apart if they tried, right? The Northern Ireland app does one thing, we do lots of things, right? So in comparison, and so it's a relative piece. The design of it is fundamentally different, but at the same time, we do share.
They did their own design, right?
Yeah, but we do share a lot in terms of what we do. So I think there's bits there where the differences as well highlight things that we could or couldn't do, or didn't need to do, or should do in the future, and vice versa for them. But it very much has to match the public health response in that jurisdiction.
Yeah, I think it's important to note as well that when we first started talking to Apple and Google, they didn't have a very good idea of how to work with public health authorities. They were envisioning a global response that sort of cut that sector out almost. And they got a pretty resounding no from Europe because of the way data handling was going to happen. But now that they're rolling out the express exposure notification apps in California, Oregon, and Washington, we're seeing that they listened, and they now have a way to incorporate the public health authorities in those places as a necessary part of the picture, which I think is real progress. Like, you have to understand that we also influence the commercial outcomes to a certain extent.
Absolutely. And, you know, Gar, you mentioned a little bit about this global community of public health experts, technologists who are all collaborating together and talking about feature enhancements and, you know, all of these pieces. How is that, you know, managing a community in an open source implementation is always challenging. How do you know who's using your product? How do you know who's accessing the project? How do you collaborate with them? How do you make sure that everything's following the roadmap and heading in the right direction? How are you all handling that side of things? What have been the advantages there? What have been the challenges?
Well, if I look at some of the stuff, so if you take the European Federation Gateway Service, I couldn't remember what EFGS stood for. So the collaboration around that between countries was actually hosted on top of the LFPH Slack.
And
so
that's the interoperability server between different countries in Europe.
So that it convened itself there. And it was one of those things that, where can we meet and where can we talk? And it just moved there. And I think that's kind of the infrastructure that LFPH can bring. And it helps that work. Now, it's not to say it's the only place. There are other places and there are other areas, but it's certainly, there are really rich and very deep conversations that are going on in that Slack group across the various channels that are there. And that's happening. I think some of the other stuff that's happening, I think it's very much, it feels like it depends on the subject of interest, right? So there's another group that's running, which is outside of that, which is to do with metrics and analytics and how do we measure, and feeding into this overall piece about how do we do comparison, how do we demonstrate efficacy. And I think another recording, or another video which will come out, so Joanna Mazel was talking about that, and there was some interesting findings in that, which I think will play into what we're thinking about. And I think these kind of things, as one group sparked another group to rethink some assumptions about the world, I think those things, it's all very loose and it's all very free form at the moment, but I think it kind of needs to be in a way, because I think if we were too rigid about it and we tried to like say, well, these are the communities and this is what we talk about and this is it, it's way too soon for that. We're not at that point. I think in 12 months time, this will be a very different space. It'll feel much more coherent and organized. At the moment, there's lots of different things still happening. And
we'll be working on standards in another 12 months.
I know, yeah.
Yeah.
There's been some early papers on that, and I think that's one of the challenges we face as well, was that people are saying, well, where's the standard for it? But there is no standard for a novel technology.
That's not how open source works.
Yeah.
Rough consensus and working code, and then the standard.
Exactly.
I think from a pattern perspective, what's really nice is that, you know, this initiative and drive has become a kind of connected tissue across governments, across continents, across public health authorities. And that's really, really powerful.
Yeah.
You know, that's so powerful. Like, and again, like you find a pattern in one country that sticks, or a solution in one country that sticks, and that connected tissue then enables that that to transfer into other countries, and that's really the power of, you know, the LFPH and the open source project, and the communities are plugging into that. You know, it's extremely powerful, and it's very compelling. You know, as a kind of a promoter of open source, and as a professional software developer, like you know, the ability to be involved, you know, as part of this connected tissue is really compelling. The ability to be involved in something whereby hopefully we're saving lives and improving outcomes, it's really compelling. Like it's a beautiful space and a beautiful area to be able to work in, you know.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think the standards and the rest of it, they will emerge from the flurry of activities.
Took the joy and the fun out of this immediately.
Yes, it'll do that too.
Yeah.
Well, there are people that find standardization joyful. There must be.
It's not me.
Absolutely. So we've talked a lot about, you know, I think that we've had a lot of wins in this journey together. What are some of the things that you wish you had done differently at some point in time throughout this project?
It depends when you ask me that question. So if you asked me that question like 3 months ago, I'd say no, all fine. Right. So we were incredibly fortunate with the team that we had, right? And that's across all the government departments,
all parts,
all the partners involved in it. We were
and also Cian's team. Very fortunate.
Exactly, like incredibly lucky. Like team in NearForm, team in XPO, team in ISAS. Like it was just great, and I can definitively say it's the best team I've ever worked on, ever. Right, hands off. It was just a pleasure all the way through. In terms of things that, but there's a little bit of me now as we get into it, and you're in the thick of it. We're into wave 2. We're into another lockdown. There's a tiny piece of my soul that wishes I didn't pick up the phone on the 17th of March.
Because you don't want to go through it again.
Because it's like, oh, Jesus, because it is a never ending thing. Because once you're in, right? You're on this roller coaster, and this roller coaster is just going to keep going. So and it's rather than, that sounds all very negative, but actually it's an energy management thing. Because something that goes on, because we're running so hot, there's only so far you can run that way. And then it's just about doing it. So for anybody getting in, this is not like quick up, running, done. Like you've got to live with this stuff, and you've got to live and run this stuff for a while and deal with the fact that this is going out. It's a population scale response in most jurisdictions. So when it's out to a population, there's a difference. So when you're looking at change, when you're looking at fixing things, when something goes wrong, it's how you how you deal with those situations. So you can't avoid it, right? The bugs come for free. And then it's how you deal with them when they do pop up, right?
Yeah,
right.
and you have to, sustaining your energy throughout this whole process is that's been something I think we've all had to work on.
Yeah, I think.
Cian, what about you? What are your thoughts on things that you might have done differently?
God, I don't know if I would have done too much differently. But I'd very much agree with Gar though. Like software is never done, and software for you know, society. I mean, software you're kind of trying to ebb and flow as things develop and adapt to the needs. You know, and it's never done. Like it's not like, you know, back in the good old days, and you get your software on a CD and you install it and use it. Like it's a whole different can of worms now. And I'd agree as well with just around the whole area of you know, there's a fatigue. You're running hot for a long time without stopping, you know, and then to add to that, like, you know, you're trying to manage your home situation. You know, most people haven't managed to take any kind of meaningful break or holiday this year. Certainly haven't been on an airplane and gone somewhere sunny and all that kind of thing. And so, you know, really have to just keep an eye on everybody that we don't burn out, you know, and I'd agree as well. Like, I mean, the problem with software in the, you know, with a public face on it is that, you know, some problem happens somewhere, and it doesn't matter where the problem came from. It's your fault. Like it's our fault or whatever. Like, and so you have to kind of galvanize yourself as much as possible, and just try and roll with the punches, and get things turned around and fixed as fast as you can, you know. And yeah.
Absolutely. Denise, anything you want to add? Any closing
Yeah,
thoughts?
I wish we had been successful at helping the UK and France, because they are close neighbors of Ireland. And we did get a lot of our close neighbors interested in what we were doing. And we will have data interoperability with those other efforts. But, you know, we could have helped them get there faster. And so I think that we have been friends of those efforts and trying to help them all along. But I wish that they had sort of just taken our thing. And then likewise, you know, I did actually get on a plane in September, and I'm in America right now, which is both, you know, nice and scary, because it's so much bigger and everything happens in so much grander a scale, and so much of this country is having unchecked spread right now. So it feels scary, right? But I'm glad that there was a decision made for California, Oregon, and Washington, but I also kind of hope that they will choose again and get a more bespoke app together, at least in California, because that's 10% of the world population of the US. And it's a very complex situation. I'm not sure one fits all is going to work for California. So I'm still kind of hopeful that we're going to find our way to helping them better.
Yeah, well, there's definitely, this is a story that's not done yet. That there's no question of that. We've made it to one finish line, but we have many more to go before I think that we get to hang up our hats. So first off, thank you for joining me today for this conversation at the Open Source Summit. Second, thank you all for your efforts to try and get us back to, back to, I won't say normal. I don't know that we know what normal will be in the future, but, back to a world where COVID is not our dominant conversation on everything. Thank you all for your efforts, for your sleepless nights, for your many, many hours on Zoom, and all of the sacrifices you've made there. So I think that we're going to be around for a little while longer, answering questions in the chat, and we'll hopefully get some good ones from the audience. And thank you all so much. And then I think if anybody does want to learn more about the Linux Foundation Public Health, you can visit our website at lfph.io. And that's also the best place to go to learn more about COVID Green. If you want to get involved as a maintainer, it provides links out to the GitHub and much more information about that project overall. And I think we would welcome new maintainers and new participants within the open source community helping out with this effort. So with that, have a great rest of your evening.
Thanks, Jenny.
Thanks, Jenny.